Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the managing editor at the Cipher Brief. Welcome to this special program. We're glad to have you with us, and we've got some great guests with us as well. 3 years ago this month, as many of you will know, the capital of Afghanistan was overrun by the Taliban. The country was taken over. The US-backed government ceased to exist, basically. And 3 years ago this week, there was a terrible terrorist bombing at the Kabul airport that took more than 200 lives, including the lives of 13 US service members. It was an awful moment for the country, of course, an awful moment for the military of the United States, and a very, very rough and difficult ending to the US mission there. We're here today to reflect on the aftermath of those events in August of 2021, and to specifically look at what 3 years of really the Taliban's second run at governing Afghanistan has brought, and to test a pledge that the United States made during those days 3 years ago, that the United States would not need boots on the ground in Afghanistan to manage whatever was left of a terrorist threat that it had basically gone there to combat almost 20 years before, in the wake, of course, of the September 11th attacks. At the Cipher Brief, we are always blessed by terrific voices from our expert community. I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but I don't think I am in saying that you couldn't have two better people to join a program and a conversation on the issues I've just laid out than the two we have with us today. General Frank McKenzie, former head of US Central Command, who was dealing in those days, as he has put it, with what he called a no good choices situation, and Dave Pitts, who was a top CIA official in the region and one of the last Americans to leave Kabul, again, 3 years ago this week. You have their full bios. I'm just really grateful to you both, General McKenzie and Dave Pitts, for being with us. Grateful also to the audience. I think you know if you've been with us before, but if not, you can submit questions in the question box. I like to prejudice questions from the audience rather than my own, by and large. And also, if you prefer, if it's easier, send an email. It's up on your screen now to my colleague Ethan Masukol. That's EMASUCOL at thecipherbrief.com, and he'll get them to us. General McKenzie, if we could start with you. You were not only in the thick of it back then, you've also written a book that is just out called Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. I'd say you're probably as best suited as any, not just for this event today, but also to have written a book under that heading. And it deals, not exclusively, but it deals with the things we'll be talking about today. You placed blame. I also, by the way, don't want to get too into politics here, but you lay blame for what happened both with the people who put together the so-called Doha Agreement, which put into motion the final withdrawal, the agreement with the Taliban, and also those who implemented it later. So I just thought, as a level set for this conversation, can you talk a bit about those statements and other things that brought us to that moment then, and then we'll bring ourselves to the present. And thank you again, General, for being with us.
Tom, thanks a lot. I'm honored to join the panel today. And what I would say is this: two American presidents, as unlike as any two in American history, shared a common objective: leaving Afghanistan regardless of the consequences. That led to the Doha Agreement, which you've noted, which was signed under President Trump in February of 2020. And it led to the final execution of that agreement in the spring and summer of 2021 under President Biden. And that's what led us to the events that occurred in August, that continuity policy, regardless of consequence, across two presidential administrations. More precisely, the environment in Afghanistan today is directly related to decisions we made in the spring of 2021 about how to do our withdrawal, and how we decided to do our withdrawal, where we brought all of our military equipment, all of our military personnel out beginning in April of 2021. We did not at the same time make a similar decision to begin to bring out our embassy platform, our American citizens, or our at-risk Afghans. And that decision, as many of you know, was not actually made until about the 14th of August. And that directly led to the tragic events of August 2021. And it led to the fact that we're not able to bring out a lot of people that we would have liked to bring out, those tragic scenes that you're all very familiar with. And we don't want to relitigate that here in this conference today, so I'll end my comment there. But I think it's important to note that the late beginning of that last phase of the evacuation really led us to events as they exist today in Afghanistan. And thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on that.
Sure, General McKenzie, and thank you for that summary. And just before we leave that, I should, for the record, and by the way, we are on the record today. Am I right that you were on record as having recommended, I believe repeatedly, that a very small contingent of American force should have, I don't know whether in the initial agreement or as it was executed, been left in country? Is that right?
It was my belief that if we went to zero, which the option that we chose, the government of Afghanistan would collapse. And it was my belief that if alternatively we left a very small military presence of around 2,500 US forces there, NATO would have also stayed with us. We believe the Afghan government would have been able to survive, might not have been pretty, but it would have allowed our partners that are not in the Department of Defense to continue their critical work against terrorist targets in the region. And of course, that's the reason we were there. That's the target that we want to go after. So that was all designed to allow that to happen. And yes, I was on the record repeatedly with that position.
Yeah. So as you pointed out, and as I said in the open, we'll leave the would have at that because we are where we are. 3 years have passed. We were just talking before we started 2 weeks ago. The Taliban marked the occasion with a parade of sorts of, among other things, some of the US-made weaponry that was given to the Afghan government and that they then took. Dave Pitts, you wrote a piece for the Cipher Brief earlier this year that I wanted to raise again and start your portion of the conversation with. Obviously, anyone who's in country for the amount of time and the intensity of experience, you develop some attachment and passion for it. You wrote in that piece that, and I think this was in March of this year, that there was no clear way forward now in Afghanistan, and quote, 2 decades of gains in Afghanistan seem to have disappeared almost as if we'd never been there. Explain, that's a big statement. Explain what you meant by
it. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel and to talk about these issues. You know, I think that just reflects the reality of the situation. I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, when you know, we were there for 2 decades, and maybe we spent some of those early years in sort of just fighting and pursuing Al Qaeda and fighting with the Taliban, and maybe not investing so much in infrastructure and the things that makes a country run, but that become a priority over time. So if you look at the government institutions, the intelligence organizations, the military, look at the private sector, the thriving private sector, look at the colleges and universities, and look at education for Afghans around the country. Just look at sort of economic progress, infrastructure, and those sorts of things, the things that a country needs. And you also had a large group of Afghans who invested a lot of their time in the future of Afghanistan, a lot. And I can recall in that last year there, and I know Frank remembers this, our Afghan colleagues used to talk about 20 years of gain. And they were talking about those 20 years of gain with the concern that they were going to lose it. And I think just look at sort of where we are today and look at where we were right after, you know, the withdrawal. All of those things went away, and I would say almost all of them, they've gone away permanently.
Is there, or go ahead. Mm-hmm.
And I was just going to add, I mean, you know, there was a lot of the private sector that tried to hang on. There were small businesses and even small women's owned businesses that thrived for a while until the Taliban put them out of business. And if you look at sort of the rights of Afghan citizens and the ability for humanitarian aid to get around the country and the limitations placed on that by the Taliban, look at the Taliban, I mean, almost making women disappear, right, with their latest edicts. It's far beyond just sort of the lost institutions. It's really the rights and freedoms that the Afghan citizens had and now no longer have. And that trajectory is still going in the wrong direction.
Right. I realize I'm asking another would have question here, Dave, but would there have been a way, in your view, granted that even if we didn't go to zero militarily, but let's say we had adopted General McKenzie's formula of a couple of thousand troops staying on, do you think there would have been a way with the Taliban in power to do the deal in some fashion that safeguarded at least some of those things you've just run through? You know, not guaranteeing perhaps, but perhaps improving the chances that some of those, as you put it, 20 years of gain would not have been so quickly lost.
Well, if you think back to the intra-Afghan dialogue that was being held in Doha, I mean, very late in the process, where the Taliban showed up and representatives of the Afghan government showed up to talk about a potential way forward. And part of that would have been, is there some version of a government here with participation by both sides that sort of reflects where we are today and could help sustain a government in the future? That, along with what Frank has laid out, it's a would have for sure, but it had some potential. But to be fair, the Taliban never engaged in that in a meaningful way, had no intentions to agree to anything in Doha. So I think for many, it was sort of a failed process when it started.
Right. Let's turn to the threat assessment piece, which of course matters especially to us at the Cipher Brief, but I think to a great many Americans as well. We published a piece earlier this year based on an interview we did with Zia Siraj, who was the last national security advisor in the country. He's not the only one. The UN has done this kind of monitoring too, but sort of an assessment of the existence and the number of jihadist groups that he claims are now operating in his country. He's now in the United Kingdom. And he mapped some 14 jihadist organizations, varying degrees of size and capability operating in the country, though he was quick to say that many of them have very limited capability and may actually have quite limited ambitions. For the purposes of this conversation, we're not going to tick off all 14, but I want to focus on a couple who are exceptions to that rule of limited capability and ambition. General McKenzie, let's start, if we could, with the Islamic State Khorasan, variously described as ISIS-K or IS-K. This is a group where, as you know, our audience knows, major global ambitions, carried out or claimed the Kabul airport attack and the Paris attack as well, the attack earlier this year at the concert hall outside Moscow. How would you assess ISIS-K generally? And if you wouldn't mind getting in your answer, weaving in the interesting fact that they're actually enemies of the Taliban, as I understand it.
Sure, Tom. So you're right. The Taliban actually have a theological disagreement with ISIS, and they've attacked them before we left the fight with varying degrees of success. They're having less success now because we were able to provide some tipping and cueing to the Taliban in those attacks because it was in both our interests to reduce ISIS. This is before we left the fight. Now they don't have that aid. Their attacks against ISIS have generally been ineffective, certainly not effective in reducing the size of the insurgency in Afghanistan. So that's a fact. But the other thing that we need to think about as we look at this is our ability to know and understand these groups is gone to almost zero. We have very little insight into what's actually happening inside Afghanistan in terms of platforms that look there, unmanned platforms, in terms of other sensors and the types of things that you really depend on having people on the ground to go out and do the retail work, if you will, of intelligence gathering. That's all gone, and it's not going to come back. So our ability to see and understand is quite limited. I believe that ISIS does intend to carry out attacks against the United States if they can. They'll do it directed if they can, but by that I mean, get agents into the United States in order to carry out those attacks, that also be willing to have it be sort of self-radicalized, if you will, what we would call an inspired attack. Those are also, I think, risks that are rising, because here's the thing, and this is the nature of sort of being able to put pressure on these groups. If a group feels that it's going to be attacked tonight in the valley that they live or in the village that they live, it's hard to think about attacking Detroit. If on the other hand, there's no pressure on you, then you have a lot more flexibility to actually work those concepts. Now, we're not defenseless here, and I don't want to paint a picture that we are. As you go international and try to coordinate these things across the globe, there are ways to gain advance notice of this, and Dave would be more knowledgeable about this than me. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is, very little effective pressure on ISIS in Afghanistan. And for Al-Qaeda, you know, there's actually a very close relationship with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. I would say the primary threat, at least from my perspective, when I was still looking at this pretty hard, was ISIS. I think it still is. I wouldn't discount Al-Qaeda. They've shown themselves to be remarkably resilient in the past, and they may yet prove to be so again. But the fact of the matter is, the Taliban aren't real good at suppressing them, and we have very little visibility on what's going on.
So 2 follow-ups to that, maybe one for you, General, and then I'll come to Dave with the other one. We both mentioned the enmity between the Taliban and ISIS-K. Is that something the United States can, because I think that they are the exception, right? So all the 13 other groups that have been identified operating now are all existing with at least the blessing, if not outward support. How can the United States play that card, given that they're not there, we're not there, the card of enemy of the enemy is my friend, effectively?
I think we're playing that card from a position of complete weakness with the Taliban because of the way we have chosen to negotiate with them in the past. The one time when we had any semblance of cooperation with the Taliban was during our exit from Afghanistan in August, where they shared a powerful goal of us leaving. We wanted to leave, and we were able to fashion limited cooperation to assist to allow us to leave. Beyond that, I wouldn't trust the Taliban to do anything. Certainly, that's a possibility. I am hesitant, though, to say that we would get much out of that.
All right, and Dave, I'm going from memory here, so you'll edit me and correct me if I'm off. But just to the General's point about a poverty of intelligence on the ground, for all the reasons he laid out, I do recall, at least with the Moscow attack this year, and maybe the one in Iran before, that the United States warned. There was, I believe, the oddity of Washington using some channels to warn both the Kremlin and the regime in Tehran that something was coming. And I believe in both cases something came. And actually, in the Russian example, I think the warning was actually that it might be related to some concert. All of which is to say, that does suggest that somewhere, somehow, we've got tentacles that are not bad in terms of monitoring what ISIS-K has planned, or do I have that wrong?
No, you've got that right, Tom. And I can't speak to exactly what the IC had, but certainly we had something. And on matters of terrorism, we're going to share that in most cases, or maybe in every case, because it benefits us to stop terrorist attacks. That's not to say that we have those great insights every day and all the time on what ISIS-K and its various affiliates might be planning around the world. If I could just follow with a couple of points about ISIS-K. You know, when it got started, it was a multi-ethnic, multinational organization in Afghanistan. So it was really sort of grassroots connected. They didn't have to bring in a lot of foreigners into Afghanistan to form ISIS-K. And so it built these really strong networks, and it's really got connections into every other organization inside of Afghanistan and among some of the people of Afghanistan. Not that they support it, but it's got those connections. So it has proven to be a very sort of an equal opportunity recruiter of individuals to join the organization, and that's helped it along the way. And if you think back to when Big ISIS made its big push in Iraq and Syria, and it was recruiting and accepting people from around the world, and groups were declaring buyout to ISIS-K. So it's very good at bringing in individuals and groups into its organization. It's shown that in the attack on Russia, where it had people who could somehow cross the border and get up very close to this target without arousing suspicion. So they recruited the right people, did some very good planning to make that happen. It's also very adaptive, back to Frank's point about what the Taliban is doing and maybe no pressure. And around 2016, ISIS-K was trying to hold territory in Afghanistan, and ANDSF and NDS and others mostly denied them that space.
We have to just pause on acronyms. So Afghan National Security Forces and
the Intel Service
right.
of Afghanistan, NDS. So they denied them that space. I mean, this was ISIS-K thinking it could hold territory. So it didn't miss a beat. It adapted. It became sort of an urban-centric group. It moved into Kabul and other places, and it continued to thrive. Very good at recruiting inside of Kabul. So now the Taliban is certainly trying to take action against ISIS-K, but ISIS is very adaptive. It's got this connection across the fabric of Afghanistan, so it is resisting the Taliban efforts. It can still conduct attacks inside of Afghanistan, and it's proven it can conduct attacks in Europe, in Russia, so certainly external attacks outside of Afghanistan. And I think Frank's point about the potential for attacks here, I mean, certainly that is their intent. They've said as much. They certainly can recruit someone to come here or recruit individuals already here. Southern border is a problem, as we know, with individuals who were arrested already for crossing that border that had some ISIS connection. So I think it's absolutely a credible threat we have to pay very close attention to.
Well, you anticipated my next question, but I'd love to follow up maybe with General McKenzie and Dave with another point on it, because it's a group in Afghanistan. I noted in the March 2024 U.S. annual threat assessment. Granted, we have a lot of threats to worry about these days, but Afghanistan rated, I think, one quick mention, and there was talk about how, generally speaking, the environment was better than it had been. Don't quote me on that. But just beyond, or to wrap your excellent analyses and thoughts about ISIS-K, so you've just said, Dave, that they have the ambition to attack the United States. Many have said that the war in Gaza has inflamed or perhaps inspired more jihadists generally to attack friends of Israel, certainly. But how would you, just for American citizens, how worried should American citizens be about the group generally and about whatever it is able to muster from inside that country? General, I'll start with you.
I think we should be worried. I'd refer to the Central Command Commander's posture testimony this spring before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. He had a very good perspective on it. I think the threat is growing. They do aspire to attack us in our homeland. They will try to do it. And again, there are a couple of ways they can do that. You know, the easiest way to do it is to inspire somebody here in the United States, what we would call self-radicalize. Do it online. You know, just decide to pick up a weapon, go somewhere and conduct an act of terrorism. Bloody, messy for them, can't control it very well, but it is an act of terror. And it's also the hardest to stop, because there's no tendril reaching across the ocean into the United States that our very effective security services can monitor. Another attack would be a directed attack, an organized attack, where people would actually come here and then plan the attack, perhaps recruit others to do it. Now then, you can have a very specific target. You might be able to control the timing of it. You might be able to do a variety of things. The risk to ISIS, though, in something like that is, again, our ability to discover it goes up considerably when they have to communicate, you know, inside the United States, across the net. We are less vulnerable when that happens. I'll close by saying, I think the risk is there. I think the risk is increasing. It is greater this year than it was last year. It will be greater next year than it was this year. And again, our ability to actually look into Afghanistan itself makes it very hard to know and understand what they're thinking. We begin to see it when they begin to put attack plans in motion, and they have to transmit those attack plans. And that's when we, probably much as I should say about it, that's when we have the opportunity to gain knowledge of it.
Dave Pitts, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Frank's got that exactly right. Look, and you talk about some of these sort of national assessments that might have been written 6 months ago. That was before ISIS-K really showed this sort of ability to demonstrated the ability to conduct these attacks internationally. And just think back to, you know, Director Ray's recent testimonies about what he said about the ISIS threat to America, and he is banging that drum pretty hard.
Yes, yeah, that's for sure. So you've both mentioned, we'll come back now to a bit later to what to do about this. There's some questions about that already, but we don't want to leave Al-Qaeda. It's both interesting and sort of awful, right, that we are still talking about that group, but we are. The various assessments I mentioned earlier of the groups that are operating now in Afghanistan all include Al-Qaeda's return, if you will, or maybe they've always been there. And also, unlike ISIS-K, there's an affinity and no trouble, it seems, with the Taliban, who, by the way, at that anniversary event 2 weeks ago, their leaders touted the law and order that had returned to Afghanistan, and they said, no longer will our country be used as a platform to do anything in other countries. I see you smirking or smiling, Dave Pitts. What should we know about what should we know about what Al Qaeda is up to in Afghanistan right now?
Are you coming to me?
Yes.
Look, we shouldn't always believe the narratives we hear from the Taliban. Okay, so they're all about the narrative. They've said several times there's no Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. They recently said there's no ISIS in Afghanistan. So I would just be mindful of putting any weight on anything they've said. You know, Al Qaeda never left Afghanistan. We know that, but they certainly took a pounding, and the combined efforts of the U.S. and NATO and our Afghan colleagues and other countries really decimated Al Qaeda as an organization inside of Afghanistan. But they stayed, right? Even though some of the leaders went to Iran, and certainly Saif al-Adil is probably still in Iran. The reason they were able to survive is they actually went into a survival mode, and because they're integrated with the Taliban, fully supported by the Taliban, so they could hide and hunker and be kept safe by the Taliban. They go back for well beyond 20 years. They share the same ideology, a very harsh ideology, much closer to the one that we're hearing from Hibatullah. They've intermarried. They speak the language. They know the country. They're fully integrated. And if you've listened to Saif al-Adil recently, the de facto head of Al-Qaeda after the Hamas attacks, I mean, he came out pretty strongly reminding everyone about their goal to attack the United States and attack the West. He used that event to rally global support, calling for attacks against the US and the West and Israel everywhere. So it's a pretty bold statement. They've been using that event to expand their recruiting efforts, a lot of propaganda. And I think what we see Al-Qaeda trying to do is take this event of the Hamas attacks and somehow show themselves to be the global terrorist leader in this event. And they're trying to rally global terrorists against the United States and the West and Israel and others. So they are definitely trying to be relevant at a time when everyone's paying attention. There's been some reports about increased, as you mentioned from Zia Sarai, some increased training camps and locations inside of Afghanistan affiliated with Al-Qaeda. I haven't seen any direct reports on that other than what the UN is saying, but it kind of makes sense with me. If you're Al-Qaeda and you've been waiting for the Taliban to be in charge of Afghanistan for 20 years, you're not going to miss this opportunity to reestablish yourself. I think they're going to look like a different organization for a while, but certainly they're going to try to reestablish themselves as an organization using this much more favorable environment they have in Afghanistan. We should be paying close attention to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
So if I understand you and some of the other things I've read about this, Dave, and maybe to you, Frank McKenzie, for this, unlike ISIS-K, there's no question that Al-Qaeda has the ambition, but does Al-Qaeda, battered as it was for those 20 years, how are they on capability right now to the extent we know it? Because you don't, unlike ISIS-K, which has championed, claimed, and I don't think we have any reason to doubt the claims that they have made for some pretty robust attacks very far from Afghanistan, whether it's the sort you described, General McKenzie, self-radicalized people, or whatever they've done, they've succeeded by their metrics. I don't believe, but maybe I've missed some, that we've seen major attacks in far-flung places lately from Al-Qaeda. So how would you assess the threat there?
Who are you asking, Tom? Would you like to take that?
Sorry.
Sure. So I would argue that I think Al-Qaeda is in a reconstitution mode right now. I think they're on their back heel, but the atmosphere, as they pointed out, is very congenial to them now in Afghanistan. So I believe they are going to be able to reconstitute. It's going to take them a little while. I think the immediate, in my judgment, which is what I read in publicly available material now, I would say the greater threat today is ISIS.
Right.
Al-Qaeda remains the great threat, and Dave is exactly right. We need to keep our eye on Al-Qaeda because of their historical, long-term demonstrated ability to survive and weather the storm and to carry out massive attacks in the West. So all those things are still there. And so we'd be remiss if we didn't continue to observe them within the very profoundly limited capabilities that we have now.
Right. Okay. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, we normally would wait for questions, but there's one that's just right in line with what you were just talking about. And that is basically why, given your assessments, would Afghanistan not have been mentioned more often in the, well, referring to the threat assessment earlier this year? And I don't know the answer. I assume part of it may be that there's so much else going on in the world, but either one of you want to take a stab at that?
I think those threat assessments that are written every year, they become dated the day they're written. And in fact, if you look at sort of when they go into publication, you have to back that up a little bit of time. And I think there's been some recent events, certainly, where if you look at the attack in the ISIS-K attack in Russia and the recent attack in Germany, I think some of that has been more recent. The other thing is, I think we give, for instance, ISIS-Core claimed the attack in Russia. ISIS-K didn't claim that attack. So I think when you look at ISIS-Core versus ISIS-K, there's some question about who planned and conducted that operation. I think there's no doubt that ISIS-K is part of that process, planning and conducting and providing recruits for that, like those individuals who come from Tajikistan. So it's a little bit of, is it ISIS-Core or ISIS-K? And I think on the question about Al-Qaeda, I think we've really seen a recent push after the Hamas attack on Israel for Al-Qaeda to reassert itself. And I think because of that, there's just been a little more interest in trying to get more information on what are they actually doing on the ground in Afghanistan. So some of that, I think, is just sort of the time frame involved in when these are written and as information develops over time on ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Now, I think without a doubt, in the 3 years since the Taliban took over, the most dramatic episode of counterterrorism in that country occurred, well, it's 2 years ago now, when Ayman al-Zawahri was killed in Afghanistan. Of course, this was Al-Qaeda's number 2. Many said sort of the operational chief, and may actually have planned the 9/11 attacks. And it's interesting because depending what you read and who you listened to, it was presented by some as, okay, well, this is a good news story that finally targeted, but also that it showed that you didn't need to have boots on the ground. Maybe you didn't even need to have the assets intelligence-wise on the ground that you mentioned, General McKenzie, and the deed was done. And then on the other side, people saying, no, this is an example of the problem we have, because there he was operating in the open with the support, by the way, of at least one Taliban minister. I think I know the answer, but General McKenzie, was that a good news story for counterterrorism, a bad news story, or something in between?
Well, I think it was a good news story in that we removed from the battlefield someone who's dedicated to attacking us. So that's a good news story. The conclusion I draw from it, though, would not be that that's a way you can do these kinds of operations. He was living brazenly in the open in Kabul. So that's not typically the way you're going to be able to process those targets. It's been 3 years. We've done one of these strikes. Certainly, there are more people that would like to strike. And if you think we had the assets to do that, we might have done it in the 3-year period. So I would say it's that's a unicorn, that event happening, and we should not draw any conclusions about our ability to find, fix, and finish targets of this nature in Afghanistan when we don't have the resources to do it.
Dave Pitts?
I think Frank's got that right.
Yeah. And can you add anything, Dave, on what we know about how that, was that just sort of handed over to the United States on a silver plate? Like, how did the United States learn his whereabouts, if you can talk about it and if you know?
Hey, I'm going to pass.
You're both laughing, may the record show.
I'll have to pass on that one too, Tom. You can draw your own.
All right, a double pass. Well, let's talk more broadly about 3 words that may have been in the lexicon for a long time. I had not heard them used in military terms until 2021 when all of a sudden they were in every sentence, it seemed, about the subject, and those were over the horizon, right? As in, you can have your force posture far away. The problem or the enemy can be over the horizon. In other words, the United States leaves Afghanistan, and its counterterrorism posture, at least, is from over the horizon and can be a success. And actually, the Zawahiri, the glass half full version of that was a success for over the horizon. But more generally, General McKenzie, what's your view in terms of Afghanistan or anywhere else about over the horizon as a way to deal with terrorist threats in other countries?
Tom, in the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021, we had an extended debate on this subject. And my argument was then and remains now to think about over the horizon into a landlocked country like Afghanistan that's several hundred miles away from the sea and with no dependable neighbors at its boundary. It is not impossible to do that, but it is very hard to do that. And here's why. The fact of the matter is you have to locate a target. That's the find part of it. And that requires localization. You have to know where that person is. And that requires that you either do that through human intelligence, signals intelligence, maybe imagery intelligence, but that's probably less useful. So you've got to find that person there, and you've got to determine that that person is actually the target that you want to hit for whatever reason. Then you got to fix that target. By that, I mean, now you have to develop a solution to it. You have to do the pattern of life analysis so that if we choose to do a strike, it's going to be done in accordance with the law of armed conflict. We're going to take collateral damage into account. We're going to do a variety of things when we think about striking that target. It's very hard to do that if you don't have agents on the ground that are responsive to immediate tasking. It's very hard to do it if you don't have a local security force that, again, asks questions, the retail level of this kind of intelligence operation. And if you don't have persistent overhead assets that can look at the target, what we would call in the lexicon of the business, soak it. You want to soak it so you know and understand pattern of life. You want to develop all these things. Almost impossible to do that in Afghanistan. Very, very, very difficult. And then the final part of the equation is, how do you finish it? So we have history in Afghanistan with this. Policymakers going back to the Clinton administration love the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile, TLAM in our language, because no U.S. person's at risk when you launch it. And we actually tried to strike Osama bin Laden under President Clinton's leadership in the 90s. And we launched the missiles, 3-hour time of flight. He's in the next valley having dinner by the time the cruise missiles arrive. There are time distance problems that make it very difficult to coordinate these strikes. Now, you can choose to do it with manned aircraft. Problem with manned aircraft is this: if you're over the target and you're deep in Afghanistan, if you have a problem with your manned aircraft, there is no way to get the crew out. That becomes a very, very risky decision for any U.S. president to take if you're going to put a manned platform over the target. The third way is even riskier, and this was talked about a lot by different administrations, the idea of a raid. Everybody is enamored with the bin Laden raid, was enamored with the bin Laden raid when we had these discussions.
Except people who've read detailed accounts of it. And the
more you look at it, the more you realize that the bin Laden raid, we lost a helicopter objective. We were able to accommodate that because we were based across the border in Afghanistan. So we had resources that we could apply immediately. The point I used to make in discussions with this when I was talking to policymakers was, if you think about a raid in Afghanistan, you should think about the raid into Tehran in 1980, where in April of 1980, where we went long distances with very finite margins for failure. And in fact, the raid did fail. That operation is much more illustrative of the danger of putting boots on the ground way, way, way deep inside a country in order to do a detailed raid like that. People talk about that very lightly. The more you study it, the more concerned you become about the ability to execute those operations. Finally, I would just say, we always talk about, well, you try to find local surrogates. Okay, maybe, but now who's going to be on the ground doing that work? We don't have anything in there right now. You're talking about running agent chains inside of a hostile country, and you lose control over what happens. You want to conduct these operations in accordance, if the Department of Defense is doing it in accordance with the law of armed conflict, hard to do it under those conditions. So I just say over the horizon sounds beguiling. It sounds clinical. It sounds like a video game. It is none of those things. And we should be very much aware of that when we continually talk about its efficacy.
Yeah, well said. I think it was Bob Gates, right, who went into that bin Laden operation with lots of thoughts about 1980 in Iran. Dave Pitts, anything to add? What do those 3 words mean to you?
Well, no, Frank, an issue he does very well and really covered that very well. I would just say from, especially the points you talked about, the lack of intelligence you have when you're doing truly over the horizon. I think over the horizon is something you are left with. It's not something you choose. And I think that's the case here.
Yeah. Well, we are left with a bunch of questions that have to do with engagement with the Taliban, some specifically about Russia. I'll just prep you so if you have it in mind. What do we think about what the Russians and Chinese are up to with the Taliban? And then questions that I guess can all be folded into something I was going to ask anyhow, which is the logical endpoint here, I suppose, which is what to do about any of this. And maybe we should go to engagement. Dave, you talked a bit about this in that piece that you wrote earlier. Even some real sort of what I would expect or think would be kind of hardline types have said the United States should engage a little bit more with the Taliban. International aid groups, of course, because for them, without more engagement, a lot of stuff isn't getting in. But Dave, rather than my put words in your mouth, what do you think about the prospect of, well, first of all, what is the United States doing in terms of, I know there is some engagement with the Taliban. Do you think there should be more or less, or where are you on that?
I think what the United States is doing is what the United Nations and most other countries are doing. That is a very transactional engagement with the Taliban on individual issues, recognizing when you go into those engagements, you don't have much leverage. I mean, we've seen that in the U.S. discussions with the Taliban, the UN discussions with the Taliban. There's not a lot of leverage in those discussions. I think it's important for us to talk to the Taliban. We have to do that. There are some things we need to be able to address in real time about our interests there and people who remain in the country and U.S. citizens in Taliban custody, humanitarian issues. So there's reasons to talk directly to the Taliban. But what we shouldn't be doing is we shouldn't be doing anything that moves an inch closer to normalization with the Taliban or rewards the regime or somehow provides de facto recognition for the regime. Certainly that's what the Taliban thinks about in all of these engagement with the US and other countries. They think about the survival of the regime and getting legitimacy for the regime. So there's certainly engagement is required, but there's risk with engagement unless we are also trying to achieve some bigger outcome. And if I could just add, I think the challenge we have is, and this is true of everybody talking to the Taliban, is we're only talking to the Taliban. So the United Nations is only talking to the Taliban. And again, I think when you talk to the Taliban, their priority is the survival of the Taliban regime, not for the health and safety and welfare of Afghan citizens. I don't think we've seen any demonstration of that. What I talked a little bit about in the paper, what I would like for us to do is to engage all of those Afghans that were our colleagues and partners, and in many cases friends for the past 2 decades in Afghanistan, who are now practically in exile around the world. Those are the people who were building that country. We're working in those institutions. We're in the private sector. We're part of civil society. We're in those universities. These are the people who know Afghanistan, and I think are a good partner for the United States and the United Nations and the international community on dealing with the Taliban. I would like to see something like the legitimate political opposition to the Taliban emerge, and it be given some space and room to grow a little bit, that it gets some recognition from the U.S. and the UN and international community, so we can have more informed voices that we know are absolutely trying to move Afghanistan toward a better future. I think that would be an element to add to the current engagement with the Taliban.
And is there, just to follow up on the word you use, leverage? I mean, obviously those groups, that would be a kind of exile community, but what are some ways you think the United States or the international community can build some leverage to affect some things, whether it's a bit of a broadening of education or treatment of women or anything else that would be in the outside interest to affect change?
I think so. There's a disconnect here, right? So what we want the Taliban to do some things, but we don't want to normalize or recognize them.
Right.
The Taliban doesn't want to do those things, but they want us to normalize and recognize them. So these are definitely two ships passing in the night. And I think it might sound a bit aspirational, it probably is, that if the US and UN and international community could speak with one voice of expectations, this is what we expect from the Taliban, this is what we expect you to do, and map out a course where maybe down the road, which would include the political opposition, normalization could come. And I think there'd be a lot of high sort of wickets to get over there. Then maybe that would be a process, and maybe from that comes some leverage. I think otherwise we don't have any leverage, and the risk is, Tom, that individual countries will begin to make their own deals with the Taliban. We see a little bit of this already because they don't see any international leadership on this issue. They have to think about their own borders, their own security, protecting their own societies, maybe their own economic interests. So I think over time what happens is the Taliban will make individual deals with countries, and once one country moves closer to normalization, you'll probably see other countries do it. And then we have even less leverage than we have now.
Same question for you, General McKenzie. If you were tasked with, trying to build American leverage, even just on the security front, to get some help on that, how might you go about it, or what might you suggest?
Tom, first of all, I agree with Dave. He had some great observations, great concept for moving forward that I would not challenge. The one point I would make, probably in addition, is that the Taliban, as they look at us, are guided by our negotiating history with them, which has been entirely supine on our side. We're easy people to negotiate with because it's all carrots and no sticks. That's what brought us to August 2021, was we never applied any pressure on the Taliban. So they are informed by that knowledge, which will make it very hard for us to go back in and open negotiations with them on anything, because of that track record that they know and understand probably better than we know and understand. And so we just need to bear that in mind when we talk about it. And I think that would apply even to something as transactional as some form of a security agreement, some form, not an agreement, some form of a discussion about security issues that we both might be jointly interested in. And I think it makes it very difficult to do that. My final observation would be, I would, like Dave, I would oppose anything that moves toward normalization right now. I think we need to be, just understand that this is going to be a matter of time to play out. The danger, though, is as actually Dave noted, is over time, other countries may begin to make accommodations because of the vast mineral resources that are inside Afghanistan. For a lot of reasons, other countries are going to be attracted to be able to go in there, and they're not going to care about human rights conditions, particularly the countries that we're talking about. They just want to be able to get in there and get to the extractives. And I'm particularly talking about China as much as anybody else. So I'm not optimistic about a way to move forward with them right now, even on something as narrow as security cooperation with small s, small c.
Well, as you both very eloquently typically do, the next question, but in fairness to our listener or viewer, what do we know about China and Russia's engagement at the moment with the Taliban? Is it all about minerals? Is it about anything else? Dave, you want to pick up on that?
It's interesting to watch China and Russia. Really, Russia's got its own long history there, but how they sort of stayed at bay until they knew we were leaving, and then they sort of made some bold steps in the country. And certainly you see China doing that. And look, China is certainly interested in precious minerals and copper mines and those sorts of things, and I think they'll be all over those things. And I think Russia less interested in that. But remember, this is where the great game started. This is, if you just think about the crossroads that this represents, if you look at the neighbors of Afghanistan, China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, India, not too far away, Turkey, not too far away, and of course, Central Asia, I think the potential for surrogate activities against the United States to take place in this region are high, and I think that's what Russia would certainly be doing. Anytime it thinks about making arrangements with the Taliban, certainly our interest will be put at risk. That's not to say we should rush in and try to do something different. It just means we should be watching that very closely. And I think we know the move China will make. They do that in other regions. They're certainly going to get in there and try to advance their economic interests. They'll make some promises to the Taliban. I think many of those promises will go unfulfilled. I expect the Taliban is a little skeptical. They know the Chinese and they know the Russians about some of that. They'll probably think through some of those offers, but I expect both Russia and China will make them offers they have a hard time refusing, especially if it's technological aid or money or things to improve some of the things they're trying to do in their own country or move them closer to receiving recognition from either of those countries. And
I imagine in general, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but back to the question about leverage, all those things that
I think he's
go ahead.
Very clearly states the problem. And I go back to the point you made. We have very limited leverage here, less leverage maybe than anybody else. Again, because of our well-established track record of negotiating with the Taliban to our detriment and to their advantage.
Supine was, I think, the word you used.
This word you used. I chose it carefully.
Right. All right. One more question from the audience. Well, you can still. We have a few minutes if you have more you want to put in the box, but. We did not raise this in our earlier conversations. What progress, if any, has there been when it comes to visas for the Afghans who worked with and for the United States in the last 3 years? I do not know the answer to that. Either of you? I mean, I know.
So I don't have any direct information, but I do know some of the groups involved in this. I think what happened with all of the great intentions our government agency has, it was overwhelmed with just a sheer number of SIV holders and then P1, P2 visas. I know there are a large number of people who come to the United States on SIVs, but I think this is an agonizingly slow process for many people in it. And I think our government gets it. And I hope efforts will continue to make that work better. I still get contacted periodically from people who knew me from Afghanistan, and they'll track me down and say, this is my situation. Is there anything you can do? And I try to find some resource to direct them to, or some group or some agency. I think we're going to be at this resettlement issue for a couple of decades, and it's just going to take a while, sadly, to get all of these many deserving people situated, either in some third country or in the United States. And I know many of them, hope that at some point they're going to be able to go back to a peaceful Afghanistan that's got a different government, but we'll just have to see if that's going to happen.
Sure. I mean, just anecdotally, I remember I did a piece 2021 and again in 2022, a guy who was a armed guard at Bagram, actually. He got out by the skin of his teeth, left a wife and kids behind.
Yeah.
He was told that, that'll get sorted out quickly. As far as I know, they're still there. And the terrible catch-22 was they had to be interviewed by a State Department or embassy person. There, of course, were no more such people in Afghanistan. And they were just told, get them to Pakistan, we'll be fine. And, sure, just get your wife and kids to, anyway. Last question I have, Frank McKenzie and Dave Pitts, it really comes back to the one about paying attention to all this, and quite apart from the actual, official threat assessments. You've given a very clear picture that that more attention must be paid while we are where we are. But understanding what you both understand about the inner workings of the government and any administration, Republican or Democratic, what have you. And we have Ukraine and Russia, and we have the pacing threat, as it is always described, of China. We have everything in the Middle East and Iran. How do we get not just the public, but the national security and the intelligence communities to worry more and deal with all the things we're talking about? Or are they being dealt with and seriously considered, as you've said very eloquently, they should be? General McKenzie, I'll start with you on that.
Tom, I think there's a certain sense across the interagency that wish the problem would just go away. That got to deal with it. You certainly don't want to deal with it in the compressed environment of a political election year. So I think there's frankly an element of that. Unfortunately, the problem's not going to go away because the problem doesn't care about an American political election. So I think that we should just recognize that's an observable fact. I will tell you this, inside the Department of Defense, inside U.S. Central Command, I believe, if you read the posture testimony of the current commander, they are firmly fixed on this, and they see it and they keep an unblinking stare on it. However, the resources that they have been allocated to conduct these tasks are very strained, and some very hard decisions about what they're going to do with those resources, particularly in an environment where you've got, as we've already noted, operations against the Houthis. You've got what's going on in Gaza. You got to worry about Iran. You got to worry about a variety of other things at the same time. So the focus is there versus perhaps not what you'd want them to be to actually address this problem, which I would argue is a very real problem and is going to become very real to Americans at some point in the future.
Yeah. Well, I hope it doesn't take something very real to focus further attention. Dave, last word to you on this.
Yeah, interesting. I mentioned Director Ray earlier, and one of the things he also talked about was a lack of resources for terrorism coverage, I think, and that's certainly just knowing our history with terrorism, that's not an area where we should be under-resourced anywhere in the Bureau or the IC or the military, anywhere else on terrorism. And I think Frank is right. It would be better if we didn't have to worry about it'd be better if we just didn't have to worry about Al-Qaeda among the other things, but we have to, right? It'd be better if the Taliban would fix itself, but they're not. I mean, so we're just going to have to pay close attention to these things. I think one of the things we should try to do, and it's of course easier said than done, and sort of one of my pet peeves about the government is we always talk about these pivots. When I hear pivot, I hear we should have done this sooner, so now we've got to make some drastic measures to pivot toward China or Russia or counterterrorism. And I think we should, again, easy for me to say, I'm just sort of sitting out here not in the government currently, but evolve more and pivot less. And that is, we shouldn't pivot away from Al-Qaeda. We should take our best assessment and understand what Al-Qaeda really is and how it can sort of persevere despite tremendous pressure, and keep an adequate amount of resources on AQ so we fully understand it to the best of our ability. And the same thing with these other issues. And I would say the ability for Director Ray to speak so strongly about these issues means that we did have some good information, and the IC could provide him with that information. But I think Frank highlighted this earlier. We just know less now coming from certain parts of these regions, and that should make us a little bit uncomfortable that the information that we used to rely on to make some of these decisions, we have less of it now from this particular area, and we should be uncomfortable with that.
All right, gentlemen. Well, normally we like to end on an up note, but there may not be one on this one. Dave Pitts, really appreciate your being with us. General McKenzie, again, by the way, for those who joined late, the book is Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. Thanks to you. Enjoy life at the university there in South Florida, and we really appreciate both of you being with us. Thanks again, and thanks to the audience. That's it for us from the Cipher Brief. Take care.
Real pleasure.